Welcome back, everybody, to Action Research. We are gearing up for session 4 this week. So the screencast will detail some of the activities that we're going to be participating in to stair-step us into the next draft, and that will be the draft section for data collection. We'll be developing the data collection plan this week. So just a couple of things to recap from last week. Last week you turned in your draft section of the introduction. You actually had 2 sections. Then you also did the draft for the research-based support for change. And I've reviewed those that have been turned in already, and they're in good shape for drafts. I'm giving feedback to you. Typically use commenting in Microsoft Word, but if you submit in a different format, then I'll figure out a way to get you comments back on whatever format of a document you're utilizing. If you're utilizing Google, please just send me a link and make sure that your sharing preferences are on, and I'll be happy to put comments back through Google. That works out really nicely as well. So multiple ways to participate, and if we hadn't already talked about that, it's a good time to bring that up. So 2 sections of the project are drafted now at this point. We're getting ready to get into the 3rd section, and that's that draft data collection plan. So we'll be spending most of the time in the screencast kind of detailing that. This week I also want you to read Mertler Chapter 4. And Chapter 4 in Mertler is about developing a research plan. And I won't talk through the whole chapter with you, but there's some key pieces to the Chapter 4 information that Mertler provides that are good. Mertler gives you some different types of study. He gets into qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods, correlational designs. Most of what we do for this class falls under either qualitative or quantitative. I don't want you to get too hung up on the different types of research plans because that's really not where I want you to have to focus. I want you to focus on what intervention do you want to tackle to ultimately improve your practice, and we'll work with that rather than trying to define it for research purposes. But when you get into some of the different types of methodologies and study design, like correlation design, it gets into deeper statistics than what we're going to get into in this class, so don't worry about it when you start realizing or reading about correlation coefficients and so forth. But that will give you a little background information for some of the research that you may be looking at if they're reporting those types of statistics. So it's just good information to have, but we're not going to get too focused on it for this class. The other piece that I like in Chapter 4 that I just wanted to draw your attention to, Mertler gets into ethics. And I spoke briefly last week when I gave you a little bit of information in the screencast about some ethical considerations. One being our subjects in our research. When you write up the introduction, when you write up the data collection plan, from this point on, we're not going to identify any of the students, so, and I'll get into it in just a minute, but we'll give aliases if you're working with individual students or small groups, or any data that you start to report. You will strip off names, and you might give an ID number that you make up for the purpose of the study. So there's no individually identifying data that will be identified through this project and the writing that you're doing. So just kind of keep that in mind. But a couple of points that he makes on page 115, he talks about principle of accurate disclosure and respecting rights and protecting your research participants, which is what I just spoke to. He talks about the principle of beneficence and the educational process. It should benefit someone or some group of people, and that's really what we're about in Action Research from the start. Talks about the principle of honesty. It's absolutely essential when conducting research. That should not even seem necessary to mention, but honesty must be exhibited in all aspects of the research study. And I want to tie that to another piece where he starts talking about the different types of hypotheses that you may make. And when we get into action research, we always want to see a positive change, and that's kind of our focus. I mean, why wouldn't it be? But I also want you to understand that in the course of developing an action research plan, it's okay if you end up with a null hypothesis that's validated. If you see no change, then at least you took something, you tried it, you researched it, you thought it would work, and you know whether or not it was effective or not. You know, for the purpose of action research and our instructional methodologies that we employ every day in our classrooms with our teaching and our students, don't you want to know whether or not you're maximizing the effective use of strategies for kids? And if you try something and you see no change, no result, good or bad, but no change, then it may be something that gives you good information too about whether or not you need to keep doing what you're doing, or then look for something else that might have a higher, one of the terms that I recently came across, a higher leverage capacity for learning. So anyway, I just wanted to think about that and the principle of honesty. I don't want anybody to think that if they collect data and they're struggling with reporting the data, even if it shows that it wasn't a positive result, it still helps you know whether or not your practice is being effective. So just don't get too hung up on always having the positive results. Any result we gather the data is still a successful project because you implemented a research plan, you tried it, you watched it, and you have something to talk about ultimately in the discussion of results. Okay, so those are a couple of key pieces out of Chapter 4 that I wanted you to look through. Mertler does a really good job in Chapter 4 also of giving you some information that you can digest about how to start to set up the research plan that we're writing about. So again, it's just another resource for you. An additional resource that I've provided in Moodle is the 5 W's and an H resource review. And we'll take a look at that really quickly. Let's see what we got. Come to that in just a second. So there's a resource that's posted, data collection, the 5 W's and an H. This came out of ASCD, the Association for Curriculum and Development. And so it's a really good piece, but it's just an ancillary resource for you to support. And your data collection, we're really going to write about why we're collecting the data, even though it may seem redundant at this point, but why we're writing about it. What are we collecting? Where are we collecting the data? So what's the environment? Even though you may have laid that out in the introduction, it's good to include it again, even though it seems redundant. When you're collecting data, how long, the timeline, who's going to be collecting the data, and how will the data be collected and displayed. So those are the things to be thinking about this week as we develop the data collection plan. Triangulation, we talked about last week, the 3 legs of the stool. So we're going to have 3 different data tools. One could be a pre-post measure, one could be a student survey, one could be classroom observations, but just be thinking about whatever change you make and what your plan will be to know the change was impactful. You'll have 3 different data tools. Getting started with data, and we talked a couple of weeks ago about thinking about what tools do you already have access to. Are there pieces of information that could maybe support you in your research that's already being collected by your school? Maybe that's attendance, maybe that's office referrals if you're looking at impacting student behaviors. But think about what do you currently have? Maybe you're looking at a change in an assessment and you've got beginning of the year data and you're coming up on a mid-year window that you could utilize as a pre and post. Those are examples to consider. Another piece in here, I shared a little bit about this last week, about different ways that you can include observation in your action research project. So that's there for your review. And analysis leading to action. That'll be the next section after we get some data collected that we'll work on, and that's the data analysis. That's where you talk about just the facts of the data you collected. You don't really do any interpretations, but that comes after we start collecting data. So this week we're focused on the data collection plan, not necessarily the analysis. So we'll come back to this resource when we get ready for the analysis piece. Okay, so that is that for this week. The other piece that I've shared with you as a resource this week is the draft data collection plan. Again, I tried to chunk out what's in the rubric for the final project and give it to you in a week-by-week document as you come to building each draft. One of the things I've highlighted here, research-based support for change. Not everyone had 7 citations completed in that section. Some people didn't even have it as a separate section. It was just bundled in with the introduction. So those need to be 2 separate subheading sections in the project. So if you still are needing to work on the research-based support for change, you have time this week to do that. Keep at it and just send me a note when you resubmit for the data collection method in session 4, and I'll go back and re-review section 3, the research-based support for change that was due last week. All right, data collection methods. Again, the 5 W's and H, we just went in it, but you're going to reintroduce what you did for your research or intervention. So if you haven't clearly stated what the intervention plan is to date, now's the time to tell the reader what you're going to do. Tell you how you're collecting the data, when you're collecting it, 3 measures or tools, and how the participants' interventions and measurements are going to be involved in the study. Keep in mind that we talked about the formal writing and trying to avoid use of I, me, or my, and keep everything in past tense again. So that is there for you as a resource. So let's get into this week's screencast. A couple of pieces here. We've already adjusted that, so I'll skip past that slide. So data collection, reporting, display, Sager says data should help win over the skeptics. So purpose of collecting valid data is trying to put concerns to rest. So we talked a little bit about that when we talked about Mertler and the ethics piece. Just think about what you're collecting. Think about your measurement tools as you're developing your data collection plan this week, and making sure that's something I'm going to be looking for is, do the tools actually measure what you want them to measure? You know, it used to be years and years ago, hundreds of years back, Stephen Gould wrote The Mismeasure of Man, and one of the examples that he gave there that kind of helps me remember the validity piece is, are you measuring what you think you're measuring? Are you having a valid measure? Because back in the day, the size of one's head size was thought to be a predictor of how intelligent they were, and that was not obviously a valid measure. So just be thinking about, as we develop the data collection plan, are we crafting valid measures that are going to help us know whether or not a change has been made in the classroom. Just to quickly come back to data sources, I gave you this information last week, but now that we're here to develop the data collection plan, it's good to be thinking through. I told you about 3 different areas that your data collection tools can come from. Your existing sources, which we just talked about. Maybe you have student portfolios that are already part of your classroom that you could utilize for the purpose of this project. There are tools for capturing everyday life. There could be diaries, logs, journals. Those could be students that are doing that. That could be you as the researcher that could be journaling and then using that as a qualitative measure of what happens in your classroom. Videos and photographs. I talked to you last week about the art teacher that used photographs to document changes in the classroom when he was trying to increase student ownership in the learning environment. You could do tools for questioning, interviews, surveys, tests. Exit tickets are another really easy tool to help determine what's happening in the classroom as well that engages the students. So you've got different data sources that you can consider as you develop the data collection plan. Data collection plan, in essence, has 3 measurement tools. You need to identify the participants, you need to talk about the materials and the procedures. That goes back to the first document we looked at, the 5 W's and an H. I provided a couple of examples in the screencast this week, and again in the slides you can go back to and pull out for review. This came out of an elementary math educator's classroom. So she was a Title I math teacher a few years ago and was looking at helping individual students. She had 2 individual students that were struggling with mathematical fluency. So she was implementing a change that she hoped to improve mathematical fluency and ultimately build confidence for the learners. So this is just a snippet out of that data collection plan. So she talks about the student in the action research, talked about the 3 components for data collection, and then she went into a little bit of a detail about each one. So again, it's just a sample of how to start crafting that data collection plan. Another one, just again so you get used to the style of writing and developing the sample data collection plan. This came out of a middle school science project where the educator was working to implement the a change in lesson design, learning cycle. So effective use of the learning cycle on student classroom participation and student success. So there were student surveys, there were journal entries, and teacher observations were the 3 data collection tools. And then this educator went on to talk about how the data was going to be analyzed. So not just the tools, but how. Once the tools are implemented and the data starts to be collected, how did they intend to utilize the data? What were they going to look for when they did the data analysis? So that was a solid example of a sample data collection plan. Again, just a snippet out of the full project. Data collection planning template. For your support and also for me to help give you some feedback, this week I have given you a kind of a collection tool, if you will, where you can lay out your research question, and then just give me a brief snippet of what intervention plan that you plan to take. You know, what are you going to do differently? You've got the research question, but what are you really going to do? And then what 3 sources of data are you going to look at? So there's a data collection template there for you to download and fill in, and then I've got a forum post. It's an assignment in Moodle that you can go fill in the blank for me, and then I'll have that collected. I can give you some feedback on that, so you'll get some back and forth on that. If you turn the data collection plan information in at the same time as the draft, obviously I can't give you meaningful feedback when you've turned both pieces in. So for those that are kind of working ahead and getting into the Moodle course earlier in the week, I would encourage you to think about what this data collection plan component, what each of the components would be for you. Turn that in early, and I will try and get you feedback on it as quickly as possible before you turn the draft in, so that we've got some back and forth time on that. All right, as we report on student data, so this is kind of staircasing us into once we get to the data analysis piece, which will be next step. So we're forecasting ahead a little bit. As I said before when we talked about the ethical considerations, remove any student identification. Even when you're writing the introduction, I encourage you, do not use individual student names, make up aliases if you're focusing on a small group or 1 or 2 students. Black out names. So if you've got data and you want to scan it in, you want to take a picture and you want to use that as kind of an example in the course of your writing, we can just use some of the technology tools and black out over names. So that's fine as well. And as I referenced earlier, you can refer to students by alias or by number. You'll see through some of the research writings, N is referred to as the sample size. So think about how many participants. And when we get into the data analysis, or even in your data collection plan, you'll refer to the size of your sample and identify that's part of your who. As we look ahead, here's kind of the stair step. We're in week 4, embarking on week 4, so we're over the halfway mark. Now at this point in the semester, whether we're fall or spring, we typically run into a break time, which gives us a little bit of additional time to catch our breath on the projects, but it also kind of cuts in at times to our data collection. So in the fall, we usually have a winter or a fall break. In the spring, we usually have a spring break that's hitting somewhere in the course layout. So use that as an opportunity to kind of catch your breath and get your bearings, and maybe give you an additional few days to think about your data collection and even capture some of that data. So weeks 5 and 6 will be a little bit lighter on the work that we have to do, because I've done that intentionally, because you're going to be focused on hopefully collecting data in your classroom settings. We're going to work on the analysis of results once you have data put together. So that will give a little bit of flexibility too, because not everybody's going to have data collected and ready to write about in the analysis at the same time. So those drafts will truly be a little bit rougher for some than others, depending on where you're at with actual data collection. So we'll get into the data analysis section of the narrative in week 6. That will be our assignment to turn in the draft of that section. We'll start to look at the dissemination of results and future directions next week, because that we can start to write up a little bit ahead, because at this point you know what you're going to do, you know how you're going to do it, and you're also going to be able to judge who's going to be a valued colleague that will respect receiving this information after you have the data analyzed and ready to report. So we can start to think about that dissemination of results. I also want you to think about the leadership role that you play in this. Don't keep it to yourself. You're all teacher leaders. You're taking the step forward to advance your degrees. You're taking the step forward to advance your effective practices. So we're not keeping this to ourselves. As humble as we may be, we're going to share this out with others, because that's how we continue to grow as professionals in the field. So I'll thank you in advance for your leadership, but we'll be working on how we encompass that leadership outward towards others with the dissemination of results next week in week 5. And by week 7, we will be ready to submit a completed project. Again, take a breath, because some of you may not have as much data collected as you want. You may not have as much to write about as you want, but this is a snapshot in time in a 7-week course. So by week 7, we will be ready, I promise, to submit a final project that will also be a portfolio piece for your master's program. Data analysis methods. Okay, so I'm only going to go into one screen on this, because we're going to come back to it as we write the data analysis piece of the project after data collection. When we get to it, and I'll come back to this again, you're going to be writing about just the facts of the data collected. You're not going to do any interpretation. You're just going to write what the data was that you collected, what the outcome. So you'll be putting data into tables, you'll be putting them into graphs, figures, charts, but you're not going to do a lot of interpretation. You may have mean, mode, median on the data, so just simple statistics. But this is also where you talk about, is the data reliable? Is it repeatable? if a peer went and did the exact same intervention plan in their classroom, would they be able to repeat the data that you collected? Is your data valid? As you got into it, do you feel like your measures that you put in place really measured what you intended them to measure, and did they tell you what you needed to know? Or would you do something differently? That will be a stair step into the discussion where we do some interpretation. Any relevant statistics, and then figures and tables, like I said. So that's kind of the next section, so you can kind of think ahead of what that will include. I give you this because the first couple of sections of the draft, the introduction, the research-based support for change, those are hard. Those are bigger, meatier sections. When we start writing about the data collection plan this week, that's going to be very technical. You're just telling people what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. When we get to the data and analysis, again, it's technical. You're just reporting the results. You're not doing any thinking about it. You're just giving it to the people. So these next two pieces that we write are going to be pretty streamlined. And then we'll get into the discussion of results, which I think you'll actually find is pretty enjoyable, because then you get to talk about what you did and what you wish you would have done and what you would do differently in the future and how it informs your instruction. Just a quick reminder, because I'd be remiss if I didn't say APA at least once in our screencast. So remember APA style. I love the Purdue OWL Online Writing Lab resource. So as I see things in papers that aren't maybe tightly aligned to APA, I will send you a link to the specific spot in OWL that might be able to help you out. When we get to the end, you will include a title page, and we'll go back over this as we get closer. Double space the document throughout, 1-inch margins, 12-point font. And if you haven't already started, APA will give you the guideline for this, but you're going to use a running header that needs to be in the upper right header section of the paper. Do not type it on every page. Use your header and for your headings and numbered pages. And if you need help with that, I can help you with that. Again, research-based support for change, you need to have at least 7 citations that you are writing about in that research base. And then start building your references page at the back. It'll be the last page of your project, and it needs to have a formal hard page break in a separate section. So just to recap, this week you're reading Mertler Chapter 4, and that's developing a research plan. You've got the resource for 5 W's and an H to review, and that'll help you develop that data collection plan, and also gives you a little bit of support for the data analysis, which will be the next focus for us. You're going to identify the data collection plan utilizing the template, and then you're going to respond to the activity I have in Moodle that will fill in the blank from that template. Revisions into the intro and research sections. As I comment and get those back to you from week 3, you can take a look at those and incorporate those into what you submit for week 4. Your draft data collection section needs to be drafted and submitted this week, and then continue to hone in on how you're going to begin your project and your intervention plan. That is it. We are short and sweet this week, probably our shortest screencast of the class. So I wish you all a great week, and I look forward to continuing to watch your projects grow as we get ready to start collecting some data. So thank you, friends. Have a great week.